By the autumn of 1879, the tall grass country west of the Big Blue River had become a graveyard of burnt homesteads. Prairie fires had already swept through 3 counties that season, killing more settlers than any winter blizzard or summer storm in living memory. The survivors no longer bothered rebuilding the way they had before. They simply waited to see whether the next wind would carry the fire toward them. Myra Ellsworth, a 34-year-old widow homesteading a quarter section along Cottonwood Draw, had no illusions about that brutal reality as she stood on the low rise behind her cabin and watched thin brown smoke lift along the western horizon. 2 years had passed since she buried her husband Silas beneath the cottonwood grove above the draw, killed by a grass fire near the Beaver Creek crossing while trying to save a neighbor's cattle. Her worldly possessions now amounted to a milk cow named Ruth, a battered plow with one bent share, a small root cellar dug into the hillside, and a strange cabin most of her neighbors had already told her would collapse before another spring. But any hope of an easy autumn suddenly withered when the western sky began to change color. It did not darken. It yellowed, taking on the dull sulfur tint of dust and smoke lifted high enough to filter the afternoon sun into something old and sick. Ruth stopped chewing before Myra touched the fence rail. That was the first warning. Not the color of the sky, not the drifting smoke, the cow. The old animal stood motionless in the pasture and lifted her head toward the west. Her ears went forward, then flat. Myra felt the shift in the air next. The steady prairie wind that had blown down from the north for 3 straight days did not ease away. It changed direction. What had been coming out of the north swung slowly around toward the southwest, carrying the faint bitter smell of burning bluestem and something older beneath it, the dry papery scent of last year's stalks catching light along miles of open country. She had lived on the prairie long enough to understand what that meant. When the fall wind swung southwest during a dry October, it was not weather. It was fire pulling air toward itself the way a stove pulled draft up through a chimney. Myra stepped down from the low rise and looked west across the flat brown sea of grass. The smoke line stretched across the whole horizon now, yellow at the top, brown at the bottom, and beneath it a faint orange shimmer that was not yet visible as flame but promised to be within the hour. She had at most 2 hours. Perhaps only one. There was no neighbor close enough to warn who did not already see the same sky, so she did not run for the wagon. She did not saddle the mare and try to outrun the fire east toward the settlement at Rose Creek. She stood still and set one calloused hand on the sod wall of her cabin and let her breathing slow until it matched the slow, anxious breathing of the cow beside her. Then Myra turned and looked at the cabin itself. At the low earthen mound that covered its roof, at the deep wall of packed sod rising behind it into the natural hillside, at the narrow iron stovepipe pushing up through 6 feet of dirt and grass toward the changing sky. She was not looking at a house. She was not looking at wood or windows or the neat front porch that made a homestead look like home in her neighbor's eyes. She was looking at a hill her neighbors had laughed at for 2 years running. A hill they called the Widow's Grave and the Mole Hole. A hill Adam Peterson from the section south of the draw had told her plainly, over Sunday coffee at the Rose Creek store, was the ugliest and most backward building on the whole open plain, because it looked like a burial mound, because it looked like something ashamed of being seen, because it looked to their eyes like the widow Ellsworth had already given up on the world and simply climbed down inside the ground to wait for death. Myra had never bothered to argue back. She only paid for her flour and rode home to the hill she had built with her own hands, one wheelbarrow of packed earth at a time. Now, standing beside the sod wall as the western sky yellowed with rising smoke, she felt, for the first time in months, a small hard shift inside her chest. Not fear, not pride, only the quiet understanding that the ugly hill her neighbors mocked might, in the next hour, become the only wall between her and the fire that had already taken Silas. Years earlier, before Silas died at the Beaver Creek crossing, before Cottonwood Draw belonged to Myra alone, the Ellsworths had spent a winter down in the Missouri River bottoms, working alongside an old Bohemian sod mason named Anton Kubelka. Anton had built earth-covered dugouts across half of Nebraska before the railroad came through, and he spoke of dirt the way most men spoke of stone or timber. To him, packed sod was not a poor substitute for lumber. It was better material. It only looked poor to men who had not watched what fire did to a wooden roof. One spring evening beside a smoky lantern in the barn, Anton had taken Myra and Silas out to a low mound behind his cabin where his own family had waited out a range fire 3 years before. He knelt beside the sod wall and pressed one broad thumb into the packed earth until the surface gave slightly beneath the pressure. Then he looked up at them and spoke in the slow, careful English he still measured out one word at a time. Fire does not kill through flame. Fire kills through air. He waited until they both nodded. Wood burns because wood breathes. Dirt does not breathe. Bury the roof deep enough and the fire has nothing to eat. Myra had never forgotten those words. She had carried them home to the quarter section along Cottonwood Draw, and 6 months after Silas died in the Beaver Creek fire, she had begun tearing apart the little frame cabin he had built her the year they were married. She saved every board that had not warped. She dug a shallow foundation 2 feet into the natural slope of the hillside behind the draw. She laid new sod walls 3 feet thick around a smaller inner room and covered the whole roof with heavy oak beams cut from the cottonwood grove above the graves. Then she began carrying earth, one wheelbarrow at a time, one shovel at a time. From spring thaw through the following autumn, she moved packed dirt onto the roof beams until the whole cabin disappeared beneath a mounded hill of soil almost 6 feet deep at the center. She planted buffalo grass across the mound in the second spring. By the summer of 1879, the roof of the widow Ellsworth's cabin looked exactly like the low natural rises that dotted the prairie behind Cottonwood Draw. From a wagon on the county road, only the narrow stovepipe and the low front doorway betrayed that anything human lived beneath the hill at all. Adam Peterson had ridden past during the second summer and told her, kindly enough, that she was wasting good labor on foolishness. The neighbors along the Rose Creek Road had said harder things. Some of the church women had stopped coming by with pies. One traveling preacher out of Beatrice had suggested, from the pulpit at Rose Creek Chapel, that a widow burying her home under the ground was a widow burying her hope with it. Myra had listened to all of it and said very little, because she was not building a house. She was building the fourth wall Anton Kubelka had described that evening in the Missouri bottoms, the wall of earth thick enough to give fire nothing left to eat. Now, standing at the base of that mound with the western sky yellowing into smoke, Myra turned back toward the low front door and began to work. The stovepipe first. She climbed the narrow packed path along the north side of the mound with a wet burlap sack in one hand and a length of tin flashing in the other. The pipe rose 3 feet above the sod at the crest of the hill. If a burning ember dropped straight down into that opening, it would find dry kindling stacked beside the iron stove inside the cabin. She wrapped the pipe with the wet sack twice, then fitted the tin flashing over the top like a cap, wedging it tight with a small flat stone she had kept beside the pipe since spring for exactly this purpose. Steam rose faintly from the burlap in the warm October air. She waited a full minute to be sure the wrapping held, then climbed back down the mound toward the cow pasture. Ruth had not moved from the fence. The mare, tied beside the small sod barn dug into the same hillside, had begun to shift and stamp. The chickens were already inside their low earth-roofed coop, quiet in the yellowing light. Myra looked west one more time, took one long breath of the strange bitter air, and started toward the cottonwood grove above the graves. Because Anton Kubelka had told her one more thing about prairie fire, and she had exactly 1 hour left to use it. Anton Kubelka's last lesson had come the morning after that spring evening in the Missouri bottoms. He had walked Silas and Myra out along the low ridge behind his own homestead and pointed to a wide black band of scorched earth that circled the mound cabin at a distance of nearly 40 paces. The band was empty of grass. The soil beneath had been turned deep with a plow that first summer and burned clean with a controlled fire the following spring, then left bare and packed hard by 2 years of weather. Anton had swept one broad hand along the black ring and spoken quietly. Fire eats what stands. Take away what stands, and fire has to jump. Fire that jumps far enough always lands short somewhere. Myra had put her own fire break around the cabin the same summer she finished the mound. She had walked behind the bench-air plow herself, turning a black ring of raw earth 30 paces out from the sod walls all the way around the homestead. She had burned it clean the following March, when the wind was calm and the frost still held at night. She had done the same the next spring. Now, standing at the edge of the cottonwood grove with the western sky yellowing into brown, she looked back across her own quarter section and saw that the black ring had held its shape through the summer. Buffalo grass had crept back in along the outer edge, but the inner band, closest to the cabin, remained bare and packed hard. It was not wide enough. Anton had told her that the safe width depended on the height of the flames, and prairie fires in a dry October could throw flame heads 20 feet into the air and cast burning ash 100 paces downwind. Her ring would slow the fire. It would not stop it. That was why the mound mattered. That was why every seam mattered. The break bought her minutes. The hill bought her the night. She turned back toward the cabin and began the second round of work. Wet sacking for the low front door. Wet sacking for the small grease paper window on the south side, the only opening in the sod walls beside the door itself. She drew water from the shallow well beside the barn until the wooden bucket ran nearly dry, then soaked every scrap of burlap she owned and pressed the wet cloth deep into the door frame and around the grease paper. Steam rose faintly wherever the warm October air touched the wet fabric. She wedged the door itself half shut, packing wet sod against the outer sill, until only a narrow gap remained for her to slip inside when the fire arrived. Ruth she led into the sod barn cut into the same hillside behind the cabin. The barn was smaller than the house, built the same way, 3 feet of packed sod walls and a mounded earth roof planted with buffalo grass. Silas had helped her frame the beams the last summer before his death. The mare came in after the cow, calmer now, comforted by the closeness of the older animal. Myra wet down the barn door and packed sod against the sill in the same way she had done for the cabin, then latched the chicken coop shut from the outside and covered its low front vent with wet sacking. The last thing she did before the smoke line reached the western horizon of her own quarter section was walk out to the cottonwood grove above the draw and stand for a long moment beside the 2 wooden crosses set into the packed earth beneath the trees. Silas Ellsworth and their daughter Anna, who had lived 4 months in the spring before her father died. The grove sat inside the fire break. She had made sure of that when she plowed the ring. The bare earth ran wide enough on the north side to keep flame from reaching the roots of the old cottonwoods, though she knew the heat would blacken the lower bark and might kill the smaller saplings along the outer edge. She stood beside the crosses with her hands folded in front of her and said nothing at all for almost a full minute. Then she turned and walked back down the low slope toward the mound cabin. The western sky had darkened into deep brown now. Ash was drifting on the wind, small gray flakes settling into her hair and along the shoulders of her wool coat. Somewhere far out beyond the ridge line, she could hear it for the first time. A low, steady roaring, the way a distant train sounded when it crossed a long trestle in still weather. The fire had found cottonwood draw. Myra had one final task before she closed herself inside the mound, and it was the one Anton Kubelka had warned her about most carefully during that long-ago spring in the Missouri bottoms. The old sod mason had spoken of it while kneeling beside his own root cellar door, running his broad thumb along the crack where the wooden frame met the packed earth wall. Fire finds the wood, he had said. Always the wood. Cover the wood and the fire runs past. Every homestead on the open plain had exposed wood somewhere. Door frames, window sills, stovepipe collars, barn hinges, fence posts standing close enough to the walls to carry flame straight to the sod. Myra had spent 2 years walking her own quarter section during quiet evenings, listing every piece of exposed lumber on the property in a small leather ledger she kept beside the stove. Now she pulled the ledger from its shelf, ran her finger down the last page, and started at the top of the list. The oak beam ends where they emerged from the north wall of the cabin. She packed them with wet clay from the small barrel beside the well, working the mud into the seams between wood and sod until the exposed grain disappeared beneath a smooth brown skin. The mud would harden fast in the warm air, and when the fire reached it, the outer layer would bake into something closer to fired brick than mortar. Anton had shown her the trick with a scrap of cottonwood the first winter after Silas died. The two fence posts closest to the south wall of the barn. She wrapped both with wet burlap and tied the sacking tight with twine. The posts would char, but the wet cloth would slow the burn long enough for the fire front to pass. That was all she needed. Prairie fire moved fast. A wall did not have to survive the fire forever. It only had to survive the front, the wooden well cover. She lifted it off the well entirely and dropped it down into the barn, then laid a heavy wet sod square across the well opening in its place. The well itself was lined with fieldstone 6 feet deep, and the water below would be safe from anything short of hours of direct flame overhead. But an exposed wooden cover left in place would burn through and drop coals into the water below, and coals in the well would poison the only clean water she had until the next hard rain. The last item on the list took the longest. The narrow wooden porch Silas had built her the spring before the daughter was born. It was only 6 feet across, just wide enough for 2 chairs, and the small table where they had taken coffee together in the last good summer of their marriage. The boards had weathered to soft gray in the years since. Myra had refused to tear it down when she rebuilt the cabin into the mound, even when Anton's rules would have said the porch was the single most dangerous piece of exposed lumber on the whole homestead. It stood 4 feet from the front door. If it caught, the flames would climb straight up the door frame and find the beams beneath the roof mound. She stood beside the porch for a long moment with the wet burlap sack in her hand. Then she set the sack down on the top step, walked around to the north side, and began pulling the porch apart with the pry bar she kept beside the woodpile. The nails came loose easier than she had expected. Silas had built the porch quickly that spring, more from love than from craft, and 2 years of prairie weather had loosened every joint. She pried up the deck boards first, then the stringers, then the 2 low posts at the outer corners. She carried each piece around the north side of the mound and stacked them inside the sod barn beside Ruth and the mare. When the last board came free, all that remained of the porch was a small square of packed dirt beside the front door and the 2 flat field stones that had served as its step. She stood there for a full minute after the work was done. The roaring on the western horizon was closer now, no longer the sound of a distant train, but the sound of something much larger, something that filled the whole sky between the ridge and the cottonwood grove. Ash fell steadily onto her shoulders and into her hair. The mare stamped once inside the barn behind her. Myra picked up the wet burlap sack from the ground where the top step had been. She looked once at the empty square of dirt beside the door. Then she stepped inside the mound. The inside of the cabin was already dim when Myra closed the door behind her. She had shuttered the greased paper window an hour earlier, and the only light came from the small kerosene lantern burning low on the table beside the iron stove. She wedged the door tight against the wet sod she had packed along the sill, then drove 2 short pine wedges into the frame from the inside until the wood no longer moved at all. The air inside the mound had already begun to change. Not from smoke, the seams were still holding, but from the strange quiet that came when 6 feet of packed earth stood between a room and the outside world. Sound became muffled. The distant roaring of the fire, which had filled the whole prairie sky when she stepped inside, dropped to a low, steady rumble that seemed to come from beneath the floor rather than from beyond the walls. Her own breathing sounded loud in her ears. The lantern flame did not flicker. There was no draft anywhere in the room. That last detail mattered more than any other. Anton had told her that a properly sealed sod cabin should hold its air perfectly still even when a strong wind blew outside. If the lantern flame moved, there was a leak. If the flame moved much, the leak was large enough to let smoke inside before the fire front passed. Myra crouched beside the small flame and watched it for nearly a full minute. It stood upright. It did not lean. It did not tremble. She straightened slowly and looked around the small room. The cabin was smaller than most homesteads on the open plain, only 12 feet across at its widest, but she had learned to live inside it comfortably. The iron stove stood against the north wall, its capped pipe running up through the packed earth roof above her head. The narrow bed she had shared with Sela's was pushed against the east wall, covered now with the wool quilts her mother had sent out from Ohio the spring after Anna was born. The small table where she took her meals sat in the center of the room beneath a shelf of jarred preserves and dried herbs. Along the south wall stood the low chest that held her ledger, her Bible, the small tin box of letters Sela's had written her during the war, and the daguerreotype of Anna taken by a traveling photographer the month before the child died. She sat down beside the table and set both hands flat on the wood. Then she waited. The roaring outside grew louder. It came in slow waves now, the way summer thunder rolled across the prairie during a bad storm, only steadier and without the sharp crack of lightning between the swells. Myra listened without moving. She had built the mound for exactly this hour. She had carried the earth one wheelbarrow at a time. She had plowed the black ring around the homestead. She had wrapped the stovepipe. She had torn apart the porch her husband had built her. There was nothing left to do now except sit still and let the fire pass over the top of the hill. Ruth lowed once from inside the barn behind the cabin. The sound came through the packed earth walls, thin and distant, but Myra heard it clearly. The cow had settled into the corner of the barn stall where she always stood during hard weather. The mare had gone quiet beside her. The chickens, half a length of packed sod away in the low coop, had stopped making any sound at all. Even the animals seemed to understand that stillness was the only thing left to do. Then the fire arrived. It did not come as a single wall of flame, the way Myra had imagined it during the long summer nights when she lay awake thinking about the Beaver Creek crossing and Sela's. It came instead as a rising pressure. The air inside the cabin thickened. The lantern flame, which had stood perfectly upright for the past 10 minutes, dipped once toward the west wall as if something enormous outside had drawn a slow breath and pulled at the sealed room from a distance. Then the pressure released, and the flame stood upright again, and the roaring outside became something no longer distant at all. It was overhead. It was around her. The whole mound had entered the fire. Myra reached out with one steady hand and turned the lantern wick down until the flame was almost gone. Then she folded both hands in her lap and sat in the near dark and waited to see whether Anton Kubelka had been right. The first thing Myra noticed was that the roaring did not stay in one place. It moved. It came at the mound from the west, rolled over the top of the packed hill above her head, and continued east toward the cottonwood grove and the graves. She could hear it traveling, not the sound of a fire burning in place, but the sound of a fire running across the open prairie faster than a horse could gallop, driven by its own wind, feeding itself on the miles of dry bluestem behind the ridge. Anton had told her about the wind. A prairie fire made its own weather. The heat rising from the flame front pulled cold air in behind it from every direction at once, and the incoming air fed the flames higher, and the higher flames pulled harder on the surrounding air, and the whole system built itself into a moving storm of fire and wind that could not be stopped by anything short of a river or a canyon or a wall of earth deep enough to give it nothing to eat. Myra sat beside the darkened lantern and listened to the storm pass overhead. The pressure inside the cabin kept shifting. Every few seconds the walls seemed to draw in slightly, then release, as if the mound itself were breathing along with the fire above it. She had not expected that. Anton had never mentioned it, but the sod walls held. The lantern flame, turned low, did not go out. The seams along the door and the window did not smoke. The air inside the room stayed clean. The heat came next. Not through the walls. The packed earth was 3 feet thick along the sides and nearly 6 feet thick above her head, and no heat would move through that much soil in the 20 or 30 minutes a fire front took to pass. The heat came instead through the stovepipe. She had wrapped the pipe in wet burlap and capped it with tin flashing, but the pipe itself ran straight down through the earth roof and into the iron stove 3 feet away from where she sat. The metal began to warm within the first minute of the fire's arrival. Within 3 minutes, the pipe was hot enough that she could feel the change in the air around the stove without touching it. Within 5, the tin flashing at the top of the pipe must have glowed cherry red beneath the flames, because the stove itself began to tick with the small, sharp sounds of expanding iron. Myra had prepared for this. She stood up slowly, walked to the stove, and opened the small ash door at the base. Then she reached into the wooden bucket beside the woodpile and poured the last of the well water directly into the cold ash inside the firebox. Steam rose immediately, a thick white cloud that filled the lower half of the room within seconds. She closed the ash door again and stepped back to the table. The steam did 2 things. It cooled the iron of the stove from the inside, drawing heat down from the pipe faster than the fire above could push it in. And it raised the moisture in the air around her, making it harder for any stray ember, if one somehow found its way through a seam, to catch on dry cloth or paper. Anton had shown her the trick with a small clay oven the first winter after Silas died. Water in the firebox before the fire arrives, he had said. Not after, before. The stove ticking slowed within a minute. The pipe stopped its sharpest expansion sounds. The air in the room grew warm and damp, but no smoke came down through the pipe and no ember dropped into the firebox from above. The tin flashing was holding. Outside, the roaring reached its peak. The whole mound seemed to shake, though Myra knew it was not really shaking, only trembling faintly beneath the pressure of the wind the fire pulled behind it. Ash sifted down from the small gap where the stovepipe met the earth roof, a fine gray dust that settled onto the table and into her hair. She did not brush it away. She only sat still and watched the lantern flame, which had begun to lean slightly toward the east now, pulled by the vacuum the passing fire left behind it. The flame leaned. It did not go out. And that was how Myra knew the mound was still sealed, still holding, still doing exactly what Anton Kubelka had said it would do when the day finally came. The fire ran east over the top of the hill, and the hill did not burn. The roaring passed the mound the way a train passed a station without stopping. One moment the sound filled the whole space above her head, pressing down on the packed earth roof and pulling at the seams around the door. The next moment it had moved on toward the cottonwood grove, and then further east toward the low country beyond the draw, and then further still until it became again the distant rolling sound of something enormous happening far away instead of directly overhead. Myra did not stand up when the sound passed. She had listened to enough hard weather come through cottonwood draw to know that the front of a storm was never the whole storm. The main fire had gone by, but the back edge would come afterward, slower and lower to the ground, burning what the front had missed. Anton had called it the crawling fire. It moved at walking pace instead of galloping pace, and it lasted much longer than the front, sometimes for a full hour or more, feeding on grass roots and dry cow chips and the small clumps of unburned stalks the main fire had jumped over in its rush across the prairie. The crawling fire was what killed most of the men who tried to shelter in shallow dugouts or plowed depressions. They survived the front because they could hold their breath against the smoke for the short time it took the main flames to pass overhead. Then they lifted their heads too soon, or opened a door too soon, or came out from beneath a wet blanket too soon, and the crawling fire, still burning quietly along the ground behind the front, found them. So Myra waited. She sat beside the darkened lantern with her hands folded in her lap and counted her own breathing. Anton had told her once that a prairie fire's back edge took as long to pass as the front had taken, sometimes twice as long. She had counted the front at somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. She would sit for a full hour after that before she moved. The air in the cabin grew warmer during that hour, not from the fire directly, but from the heated earth of the roof mound slowly giving up its stored warmth back into the room below. The lantern flame stopped leaning east and stood upright again. The stovepipe cooled. The ticking of the iron settled into silence. Somewhere behind the cabin, inside the sod barn, Ruth lowed twice in a soft, anxious sound and then went quiet again. The mare stamped once. The chickens made no sound at all. Myra thought about many things during that hour. She thought about Anton Kubelka, who had died 2 winters back in a small farmhouse in Saline County, without ever knowing she had built the mound the way he had taught her. She thought about Silas, and about the Beaver Creek crossing where he had died trying to save cattle that were not even his own. She thought about Anna, who had lived 4 months and whose small daguerreotype now sat inside the low chest along the south wall, while the fire that had killed her father passed harmlessly over her grave. She thought about the neighbors along the Rose Creek Road, about Adam Peterson and his frame cabin standing tall and clean on the section south of the draw, about the traveling preacher from Beatrice who had spoken from the pulpit about widows burying their hope, about the women who had stopped bringing pies. She did not think about them with anger. She only thought about them with a strange quiet that she had not felt in the 2 years since Silas died, because the fire that was passing over the top of her mound at this exact moment was, almost certainly, passing over their cabins too, and their cabins were built of wood. The thought was not triumphant. It was only sad and quiet and true. She hoped they had time to hitch their wagons. She hoped they reached Rose Creek Settlement before the front caught them. She hoped, even Adam Peterson, who had told her plainly that her hill was the ugliest building on the plain. When the hour was finally up, Myra turned the lantern wick back up until the flame stood full and bright. Then she stood slowly, joints stiff from sitting motionless for so long, and walked to the door. She listened for a full minute with her ear pressed against the wet sod she had packed along the sill. The roaring outside was gone. The crawling fire was gone. There was only silence and the faint far-off wind of a prairie that had already given up everything it had to give. She began to work the pine wedges loose from the door frame. The door swung outward against the packed sod she had wedged along the sill, and the first thing that reached Myra was not heat or smoke, but a strange gray silence that seemed to have settled over the whole quarter section while she waited inside the mound. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before she stepped through. The light outside was wrong. It was still afternoon by the position of the sun, but the sky had turned the color of old iron, and the sun itself hung low and red behind a thick veil of drifting ash. She had never seen daylight look that way before. It was not sunset. It was the color of a world that had just finished burning. She stepped down onto the flat square of packed dirt where the porch had stood that morning. The 2 fieldstones that had served as her step were still there, warm to the touch through the soles of her boots but not scorched. She looked west first, the direction the fire had come from, and she saw exactly what Anton Kubelka had told her she would see. The prairie was black, not dark, not scorched black. The tall blue stem that had covered the ground west of the cabin only 2 hours earlier was gone completely, burned to the roots and beyond. What remained was a smooth carpet of fine gray ash lying over blackened soil, stretching all the way to the western horizon without a single standing stalk to break its surface. Small columns of white smoke still rose here and there where a cow chip or a dry root continued to smolder, but the fire itself had moved on east and left nothing behind it that could burn again. The fire break had held. The black ring of plowed earth around the cabin was still visible, though only just, because the ash from the burned prairie had settled across it and made the whole quarter section look like one continuous field of gray. But inside the ring, on the small circle of ground she had defended, the buffalo grass was still green. Scorched brown along its outer edge where the heat had reached it, but green underneath, alive, undamaged. The mound itself was intact. The buffalo grass she had planted across the top had burned off in a thin crust, but the packed earth beneath was untouched. The stovepipe still stood at the crest, wrapped in blackened burlap that had charred but not burned through, the tin cap still in place. The oak beam ends where they emerged from the north wall of the cabin were coated in a hard, baked shell of clay that had done exactly what Anton said it would do. Nothing on the mound had caught fire. Nothing had even come close. She walked around the north side of the hill toward the barn. Ruth lowed the moment Myra set her hand on the barn door, a soft, welcoming sound that broke the strange gray silence more than anything else could have. Myra pulled the wet sod loose from the sill and opened the door and stepped inside. The cow was standing exactly where she had left her, calm now, breathing steadily. The mare came forward and pressed her nose into Myra's shoulder. The chickens, in their low coop against the back wall, began the small querulous clucking of birds who had been quiet for too long and were now ready to complain. Everything inside the barn was alive. Everything inside the mound was alive. The homestead had held. Myra walked back around to the front of the cabin and stood beside the empty square where the porch had been. She looked east now, toward the cottonwood grove above the draw. The grove was still standing. The old cottonwoods had lost most of their lower bark to the heat, and the two smallest saplings along the outer edge were black and dead, but the main trunks had survived. The two wooden crosses beneath the trees were still there, scorched along their western faces but standing. She stood there for a long time without moving. She had not cried when Silas died. She had not cried when Anna died. She had not cried during any of the 2 years since. She did not cry now either, but something moved inside her chest that had not moved in a long time, a slow warm loosening beneath the ribs that felt almost like breathing after holding a breath for far too long. Then she looked south, toward the section where Adam Peterson had built his tall, clean-frame cabin, and the warm feeling left her. Because there was smoke rising from the Peterson section that was not the smoke of a prairie fire that had already passed. Myra saddled the mare within 10 minutes of seeing the smoke. She did not stop to change her ash-stained coat. She did not stop to eat, though she had not taken food since morning. She only filled the wooden bucket from the well, which had held clean beneath its wet sod cap, tied the bucket to the saddle horn along with 2 heavy wool blankets soaked from the same water, and rode south across the still-smoking prairie toward the Peterson section. The mare did not want to go. The horse had come out of the barn calm and unhurt, but the black burned ground under her hooves frightened her, and the small columns of white smoke still rising from smoldering roots made her shy sideways every few paces. Myra held her steady with her voice and with a firm hand on the reins and kept her moving south at a slow, careful walk. The ground was hot enough through the mare's shoes that Myra could feel the warmth rising through her own boots in the stirrups, but it was not burning, only warm, the way a hearthstone stayed warm hours after the fire in it had died. The Peterson section lay 1.5 miles south of Cottonwood Draw along a low ridge. Adam Peterson had built his frame cabin on the highest point of his quarter, a 2-story house with a wide front porch and glass windows he had freighted out from Beatrice at considerable expense. His barn stood 40 paces east of the cabin, also frame, painted red with white trim. The whole homestead had been the pride of the Rose Creek Road, the sort of place traveling preachers pointed to from the pulpit as an example of what a hardworking man could build on the open plain in only 3 years. The smoke Myra had seen from her doorway was rising from what remained of that homestead now. She came over the low ridge and stopped the mare on the crest and looked down at the Peterson section without moving for almost a full minute. The frame cabin was gone. Not damaged, not burned partway through, gone. Only the fieldstone foundation and the iron cookstove and a tall brick chimney remained standing above a smoldering black square where the house had been. The barn was in the same condition. The red paint had burned off along with everything else, and only the dark rectangle of the barn's foundation stones marked where the building had stood that morning. Myra urged the mare down the slope at a careful walk. As she came closer, she began to see other things. A wagon on its side beside the ruined barn, the wheels burned to their iron hubs. A milk cow lying dead in the pasture, killed by smoke rather than flame. A scatter of chickens dead near the ruined coop. And beyond the cabin, near the small stand of young cottonwoods Peterson had planted along the northern edge of his section 3 summers back, a low shape half hidden in the ash that Myra did not recognize at first, and then, when she did recognize it, made her pull the mare to a hard stop. It was a man lying face down in the burned grass. She dismounted before the mare had fully stopped moving and ran the last 20 paces on foot. It was Adam Peterson. His coat was burned across the back and shoulders, and his hat was gone, and the hair along the back of his head was singed short and black. But when she rolled him carefully onto his side, he groaned and his eyes opened, and he looked up at her with the confused, unfocused stare of a man who had not expected to open his eyes again at all. "Myra," he said. His voice came out as a dry, cracked whisper. His lips were burned. She did not answer him. She only reached for the wet blanket tied to her saddle, unfolded it, and draped it across his shoulders and chest. Then she poured a small amount of water from the wooden bucket onto her own gloved hand and pressed the wet cloth of her glove against his cracked lips until they softened enough for him to accept a slow, careful sip directly from the bucket. He drank. He coughed. He drank again. Then he tried to speak once more, and this time the words came out clearer, though still cracked and thin. "I couldn't outrun it. The wagon axle broke. I ran back for the well." Myra looked past him toward the low stone rim of the Peterson well 50 paces away. The wooden cover had burned. She understood at once what had happened. Adam had reached the well only to find its water fouled by burning coals fallen from the cover, and he had turned back toward the cottonwoods and collapsed there when his lungs finally gave out. She looked down at him and spoke for the first time. "Can you sit a horse?" Adam Peterson could not sit a horse alone, but he could sit one with Myra behind him holding him upright, and that was enough. She lifted him with more strength than a woman of her size should have had, though 2 years of carrying wheelbarrows of packed earth up the side of a hill had given her arms and shoulders that most of her neighbors had never guessed at. She got him into the saddle. She swung up behind him. She turned the mare north across the burned prairie toward the mound at Cottonwood Draw. The ride back took nearly an hour because the mare could only walk with 2 riders across the warm ground, and because Myra had to keep one arm around Adam's chest the whole way to keep him from sliding sideways off the saddle. He drifted in and out of full awareness. Twice he began to speak and could not finish. Once he said Myra's name and did not seem to know why he had said it. The rest of the time he only breathed, slow and rasping, against the wet blanket she had pulled up around his shoulders and neck. By the time they reached the mound, the strange gray daylight was beginning to fade into an even stranger red dusk, the sun setting behind a horizon still hazy with drifting ash. Myra got Adam down from the mare and into the cabin, and onto the narrow bed she had shared with Silas. She built a small fire in the iron stove, boiled water, cleaned his burns as gently as she could with clean cloths torn from a spare sheet, and covered him with the wool quilts her mother had sent from Ohio. Then she sat beside the bed with her hands folded in her lap, the way she had sat beside her husband and her daughter in their last hours, and she watched him breathe. He lived. By morning his breathing had steadied, and by the second afternoon he could sit up and take broth from a wooden spoon, and by the third day he could speak clearly enough to ask questions about what had happened to his cabin, though Myra answered those questions carefully, and only as much as she thought he was ready to hear. On the 4th day, a wagon came up the county road from the direction of Rose Creek Settlement. It was Reverend Cobb from Beatrice, the same traveling preacher who had spoken from the pulpit about widows burying their hope. He had ridden out with 2 men from the settlement to count survivors along the Rose Creek Road. 6 homesteads had burned to their foundations. 2 families had reached the settlement in time. 3 families had reached the shallow gravel bottom of the Blue River and survived by lying in the water beneath wet blankets while the fire passed. 1 family had not been accounted for at all, and Adam Peterson had been given up as lost the morning after the fire. Reverend Cobb stepped down from his wagon in front of the mound and looked at the low green hill of Myra's cabin for a long moment before he spoke. He looked at the black prairie stretching away in every direction around it. He looked at the barn dug into the same hillside, and at the cow standing calm in the small green pasture inside the fire break, and at the chickens scratching in the packed dirt beside the coop. He took his hat off and held it in both hands in front of his chest. Then he stepped forward and asked, quietly, whether Adam Peterson was inside. Myra nodded and stepped aside from the low doorway. The story of the widow Ellsworth's mound spread along the Rose Creek Road that autumn and through the settlements along the Big Blue River all through the following winter. It was never written in any newspaper. No county ledger recorded it. It lived the way most frontier knowledge lived, in the memories of the people who had seen it, and in the quiet Sunday conversations of the neighbors who had once laughed at the widow's grave and now, having lost their own cabins, came to her hillside to ask her how she had done it. Myra told them plainly. She told them about Anton Kubelka. She told them about the fire break and the wet burlap and the tin cap on the stovepipe and the water in the firebox before the fire arrived. She told them about the porch her husband had built her and about tearing it apart with her own hands on the last afternoon before the fire came. She did not tell them anything she had not been willing to tell them 2 years before. The difference was that now they listened, because the prairie only asks one question of every home built upon it. Can the fire get in? And that autumn beneath the buried ridge at Cottonwood Draw, it could not, which was why the fire never truly found her.